Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me again. This is part 8 of our full stack Apollo GraphQL with React and Node tutorial. And in the last video, we basically wrapped up the backend part of our tutorial. We by no means completed everything that you should do in terms of best practices, nor did we really take advantage of everything that Apollo server has to offer. Basically, it was just to give you an idea of how to set up a backend to connect with a front end once you've decided to go ahead and build a full stack GraphQL application. Now, by building the backend, what we've done was we've set up the Apollo server to take all of the data that we get from our, say, remote requests to the earthquake catalog and get data that we have in our user API. We bring it up and we store it in sort of a data cloud inside the Apollo server, and it's made ready in such a way that when we want to access it, we get it back in a very customized and simplified form. All we need to do now is on the client side, set up a connection. So we'll actually hit a single GraphQL endpoint that will access all of that data that we have available in our Apollo server. So one thing I'd like you to do now is, if you could, go ahead and run your Apollo server. Remember, our script was npm run server. All right, and once you do that, bring up the Apollo GraphQL playground. Now remember, we were using the endpoint here, localhost 4000. But if you add to it GraphQL, you still have a viable endpoint here, right? And it still allows us to do all of the things that we have been doing so far, like, for example, making a query. All right, we can get the list of earthquakes. And remember, to actually directly access the data that we get from our remote API from the earthquake catalog, we need to also use quakes again, and we had available the ID, the magnitude, the location, and when it happened, for example. We also had a cursor available to us so that we could keep track of the batches that we were getting. For example, we have it set up so that when we request data, we get it loaded onto the say the client page 20 data points at a time, meaning 20 earthquake events at a time, right? And that cursor keeps track of where you are in terms of all the events. So, like, for example, here, let me just show you here. We have the cursor field, right? And that tells us the cursor of the last data point in that batch of 20, and in this case it was a Unix timestamp that we were using to keep track of it. Alright, so let's go ahead and send that request. Alright, and remember, well, here it is right here. There's that cursor value. Right, and that corresponds to the cursor in our last quake data point. So if I go all the way down to the bottom, and remember this, 560. Sorry, I didn't add the cursor over here in our request. I'll go ahead and run it one more time. So again, that last, sorry about that. The last 3 digits of our cursor here should match the cursor that we have attached to our last data point. Right here. So that when we run our next query, we want to get the next 20 earthquake events loaded. All we need to do is go up here and pass in as a parameter after, and then as a string we pass in that cursor value. We want to see everything after this data point, the data point that corresponds to this cursor. What you could do to make it easier to follow, to make sure that it's working, and I think we did this before, is go to the next to the last event and grab that cursor. Right? Go ahead and copy it and paste it in here. Now that means that when we run our next query, which means to load the next 20 events, we're going to load the next 20 events after this event. So that means the first one should be the cursor with the last 3 digits of 560. Right, and when we run it, we see that indeed the first event has that cursor. All right, so basically I wanted to point out that you can add GraphQL /GraphQL to your endpoint. And we're going to do that when we set up the client side here in a moment. Now basically, if you're sort of new to web development, you're thinking about what it means to be a client, right? All we're talking about is how we access that server, right, from the user side. For example, this GraphQL playground is a fetching client, right? It allows us to get data. It allows us to update and add new data, for example. Right, so this is sort of a proxy front end for us, right? Because we haven't built out our front end and we don't render any views for our application yet. Once we add in the client side, and we're going to do that using React, then we'll be able to graphically display our information or our data in a more easy to follow way. I mean, you wouldn't want to have a website where everything looked like this, all of the data that you were displaying. Although it is, nice for testing purposes. So anyway, without talking too much more about what we're doing, let's go ahead and add a client folder to our project. And since we're going to be using React, what we can do is create React app to get things started. It makes things easier. So let's go ahead, and if you have create React app installed on your computer already, you can just do npm init and React app. Sorry, Butterfingers here. And then we're going to just call this project, or this folder, sorry, client, right? And this will just basically build out our whole client folder with the React app. So again, make sure you're in the root of your project. My project, I titled it Quake Hunter. You probably did the same, just to keep things easy. But if you didn't, make sure you're in the root. Go ahead and add Create React App now. And then while we're waiting for that to get built, go over to your Apollo docs page and go to part 5 of the tutorial that we've been following. It's called Connect Your API to a Client. All right, so let's see if we've got that done. Okay, good. So our client folder is now there. All right, you can see it's a Create React app. If you go into your package.json file, it's got all the usual stuff that you get with the Create React app. Right? For example, the usual scripts for running builds and start and tests. And then the usual dependencies, right? Which include React and React DOM, of course. But now we need to add a few more dependencies. So we'll do that. And the dependencies we'll need are going to be Apollo client, which is just a complex client that allows us to make get and post requests to our GraphQL endpoint, and it also allows us to do data caching. So that way that when we make requests and we get information back, that's stored locally so that when we want to see it again, instead of going over the network to the server endpoint, we can just grab it from cache memory. Also, we'll be using React Apollo, but we'll be using an updated version called Apollo React Hooks. And that'll allow us to use React hooks more comfortably with our application. Right, and we'll also use something called GraphQL tag, which will allow us to write our client-side queries to look just as they look in our Apollo GraphQL playground. Right, we can just basically copy this part of our code and just paste it in for our queries on the client side. So anyway, let's add those dependencies now. So first, Apollo client. And we want to add this not to the root, but we want to add it to the client folder. So you'll have to cd into the client folder. All right, good. Now install those dependencies. So we've got Apollo client What else was it that we need? We need GraphQL tag. We're not going to add React Apollo yet because we're not going to use it yet. Excuse me. So there's GraphQL tag. All right, and we'll need 2 more dependencies for now. All right, so go down to where it says create an Apollo client. So just like creating an instance of Apollo server, we're going to create an instance of an Apollo client, right? And we're going to call it client. All right, and then what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our entire application in something called Apollo provider, right? And that it's if you've worked with Redux before, you'll understand what we're doing once we start doing it. But we're going to pass the client as props, and that's going to make all of the data in our GraphQL endpoint on the server side available to our entire application through the client side. All right, but let's add these dependencies. The first one we're going to add is called Apollo cache in memory. All right, and this just allows us to do that data caching we just talked about. All right, it's just a tool for making that easier. And also we're going to add another one called Apollo link HTTP. Right, and this is going to allow us to make our get and post requests without using something like Axios or Fetch. This just has a nice, easy way of making those requests to our GraphQL endpoint. Right, so with these 4 packages, well, let's go ahead and install those 4 packages now. And remember, we're installing those in the client folder, so if you haven't navigated into that directory, please do so. These will take about a minute or so to install. So while we're doing that, let's go to our index.js file in the source folder of our client. Okay, and our client is just a create React app. Okay, so in client, go to source index.js, and I'm sure you've seen this code before if you worked with create React app, and go ahead and just get rid of everything in there right now. All right. We'll put some of it back later, but it's not too hard. We'll just probably copy and paste from the Apollo docs code. So get rid of that. All right, and paste in this code right here. Okay. So now that our dependencies are installed, let's quickly go into the package.json of our client folder. And we see that we have them: Apollo cache in memory, Apollo client, Apollo link HTTP, and GraphQL tag. All right, so these are all available to us now, so that in our index.js folder, we can use them. All right, and the code is already written for us. One thing we'll do now is add GraphQL here. All right, we'll make that our endpoint. Okay, because as you saw just a few minutes ago, we were able to do that. Now, if you look so far, we've got in-memory cache from the Apollo cache in-memory package, and we create an instance of it called cache, and then we also bring in HTTP link from the Apollo link HTTP package, and we create an instance of it called link, right? And we pass in as a parameter our endpoint here. Then what we're going to do is take both of these instances and pass those to our client. But our client right now, we haven't used it yet. So if you go a little bit further down the page where it says make your first query, right? It says we're going to send a query with vanilla JavaScript, meaning we're not going to use React yet. And of course, if you look at your code right up here, you don't see that we've imported React or React DOM, but we're still going to make a query. So what you can do now is import GQL from GraphQL tag. All right. Put that here. And then it says add this code, which is just a query, to the bottom of your index.js file. Excuse me. So basically, because you've passed in this fetching function here in your client, all we need to do is just say client.query, for example, or say client.mutation to actually make the mutations and queries that we do in our Apollo or our GraphQL playground. But in our case, we are not using launch, of course. Remember, our queries were Quakes and Quake. This example is set up for an individual launch event, and we do have defined in our schema a basic Quake event. Remember, if you go over to your schema.js file, right, we do have an individual Quake query set up, but we haven't put in a resolver for it, so we're not going to use this. We are going to use the full Quakes query for all the Quakes. Alright, so in your index.js, change this to Quakes. Alright, and get rid of this here because we're not passing in any parameters. Now, the query name, they called theirs getLaunch. We could call ours getQuakes. And really, it doesn't matter what you call it, as long as you don't reproduce, or as long as you don't make another query with the same name, you'll be okay. Alright, now, rather than write in our Quakes here, like for example, we know that for our Quakes query, wait, hold on a sec. Let me just make sure here. Go to our GraphQL playground. For our Quakes query, right, the first part, the first fields we have available to us are cursor, has more, and then Quakes. What we want to see are these Quakes. Alright, we don't really care about this right now. We'll be using those in a minute. So you can get rid of those. And also, we're not worried about pagination at this moment. So we'll go ahead and just pass in the query like this. Okay, so grab all of this and paste it in right here. Should be good right here. Okay, and for some reason the formatting isn't all that nice. Good. Alright, so this should make our query for us. Okay, and then we're using just a a simple promise to get our result. So I think we should be good to run that query. Okay, so set up your server. Sorry, not set up your server. Get your server running. But first we'll have to go back into the root of our project. All right, what did I do here? All right, good. All right, so go back into the root of your project, run your server. Good. And now what we'll want to do is we'll want to also run our client server, which is running in the browser. So you could go to the client folder, and I'm using git bash. I'll open up an instance of it here. And since we're using create React app, I can just do npm start. And that should open up a tab in the browser. Right, and we have a blank white screen here. Even though you can look up at the top, you see your fav icon, so you know your React app is running. But we have a blank page. Sorry, did I say server? We have a blank page here because we're not using React, right? You can look up here at the top of our index.js file. We haven't even imported React or React DOM. Right, but now you can go into your developer tools in the console, and you see that there's an object there waiting for you, right? And if you open that up, that is from your request that you make here, right? We have our query. Okay, and let's see that our query worked okay, which means we are actually getting data from our GraphQL endpoint on the back end. right? We can click on data, click on quakes, and we see that we get 20 quakes, right? Because remember, we're only loading 20 at a time. And we can see that we get their ID, their magnitude, their location, right, when they happen. So we're getting our data as we wanted it, in exactly the way that we wanted it. So that you see from the client side, we can get our data and bring it into our React app. Right, we're just not rendering it as a view yet here. Okay, and also you see that there's another property here. It says loading false, right? Now it does take some time to get that data back, right? Because you still are sending your request to the backend, which means to a remote endpoint. And it might take a few milliseconds or a second or whatever. And while it's doing that, this will read loading true. And you can use that to display a message to say, please wait while loading, or you can add an animation like a spinner or something to let the client know, let the user know that it's loading the data. Okay, so that's useful for us. All right, but for now, go ahead and close that. You can stop your React app. I don't know why that's not working here. Okay. I think it's just my computer. There we go. All right, so get rid of that. Go ahead and, you can leave your server running it for now, I guess. It's not a big deal. But go back into your index.js folder, or file, excuse me, and just get rid of all that we entered just now. We don't need it. All right, and you don't even need to import GQL from GraphQL tag. We're going to do that in a separate file. Okay, so going back to the docs, gives you a little bit more information here about what we've just done. So if you are following along, please stop the video, maybe take some time to read that. Now it says here Apollo client, which we're using, it's designed to fetch graph data from any JavaScript front end, although we're using React. Now it says here it works, doesn't say here, but it does work best with React. And I think that the whole Apollo client is kind of built to be used the best with React. And as React is, I think, the most popular framework available right now, you know, it makes sense for us to use it. So anyway, it says here now, connect your client to React. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so we're going to use something now called Apollo Provider, and that is included in the Apollo React Hooks package. So we'll have to go ahead and install that. Right, and this is going to go in our client folder. So once again, I guess we'll have to stop our server, go back into the client folder, and install that package. All right. Another thing is we ran our server using one CLI, and then we had it open up another instance of a CLI to run our React app. And that's kind of burdensome. So why don't we use the concurrently package to make things easier for us? All right, so go back into your root and add as a dev dependency the concurrently package. And remember what concurrently does for us is it allows us to run multiple scripts with one single command. So go ahead and install that, and if you haven't used concurrently before, you can go to the npm page, npm concurrently homepage. All right, and it tells you how to use it. And basically we're going to use it just like it's used here. So copy that. All right, so go into your package.json in your root, right, and go to your scripts. Excuse me. So we've got a server script here. Now we'll want a dev mode script. All right, so we'll call that dev. Actually, forget it. We're just going to paste in what we just copied. All right, we'll need a comma there. I'm not going to call it start. We're going to call it dev. You don't have to. That's just what we're going to call it. All right, and the first command we're going to run is our server, right? So that's going to be npm run server. All right, we've already got a server script. And the second command we're going to run is from our client folder, right? It's npm start for React, right? So we're going to have to cd into the client and in this case, let's do run React start. And then what I'll do is I'll create another script here called React start. So then we don't actually have to do this here. And I also need npm. That's important. All right, so for React start, why don't we just say cd client and run start. Okay, so that should work for us. Let's go ahead and test it out. So we'll do npm run dev, right? Because we've created this new dev script. All right, so far it's working. It started up our server. What happened here? We've got concurrently in there. So it didn't open up that other browser. Sorry, we've got an error here. Ah, sorry. npm start. Yeah, so that's the way that Create React App works. And if you're not following that, just go to your client folder, go to your package.json file, look at the scripts, right, and you just do npm start. You could do npm run start if you like, but you don't have to. All right, so I'll go ahead and close out the package.json for the client folder. And now that we have npm start, it should work. So one more time, let's run that dev script. Okay, their server's up. Create React App is running. Okay, but if you go back into your DevTools in your console, sorry, that's not what we wanted. You'll see that we no longer have that data object because we erased our code. Now it says client is assigned a value but never used, and that's because now in our index.js, client is going unused. All right, but go ahead and stop that for now. Go back to your docs. And we installed Apollo React hooks. Let's make sure that that's in there. That should be in our client package.json. Yep, there it is. Okay, so we can use Apollo Provider now. Let's take a little drink of water here. Okay, so we'll have to add these three parts to our index.js folder. And you can understand the React and React DOM part. That's par for the course if you're using React. So at the top, we can add them. I typically like to keep the React and React DOM imports at the very top when I'm working with React, but that's just my own personal thing. You don't have to do that. All right. Now it says import pages from pages. That assumes that we're going to create a pages folder. We're not at this point, and actually what we're going to do is just use the app.js file because it's already given to us, with create React app. So copy this here, right? And at the bottom of your index.js file, paste that in. All right, now it says here you've got pages as a component, but we're not going to do that. We're going to use app, right? So we'll have to import that. Let's call it app from app. Good, that's the app.js file. So let's go into our app.js file. Whoa, okay, there it is. Sorry. So remember, with create React app, you get this simple app.js file that when you run your dev server for the first time, you'll see the React logo. It'll give you a link to like React, the React docs to learn more about React. Okay, so that's being brought in to our index.js file, and it's being used here, right? And you'll see that with Apollo Provider, we're using it to wrap our entire application, and we're passing in as props our client, right? So again, that makes data fetching and data caching available to our entire application, which is nice. Okay, so let's run things and see where we're at. So again, npm run dev. Hopefully we don't get any errors. Okay, good. So there's our basic create React app. All right, and if you look, the text, for example, looks a little bit unstyled, and you've got this blank space all the way around the edges here. And that's only because we're not importing index.css from or into our index.js folder, so we can do that. All right, and if we do that, we get hot module reloading, go back, and everything looks okay. You see the font has changed, those spaces are gone. Okay. Now it says edit src app.js and save to reload. We're going to do that. Okay, so for now, go ahead and go to the next part of the tutorial. It's called Fetch Data with Queries. And it says here we're going to use something called the useQuery hook from Apollo React Hooks. And that's going to allow us to easily make requests to our GraphQL endpoint. All right, so for example, if we want to get our earthquake data and actually render it as a view using React, we can do that. All right, so if we're going to use their code, we're going to want to use fragment. Right, and if you look here, it says they're creating a file called launches.js in the pages folder, but remember, we're just using app.js for now. So you can go into app.js and make sure that you bring in fragment. All right, we don't need this logo anymore. We're not concerned about displaying that. All right. We're also going to need that GQL from GraphQL tag, right? We were using it in the index to make our simple initial query, but now we're going to make our queries from this file. So bring in these two import statements as well. Okay, now you have an import statement here. We're not going to bother with that. They've made their own custom components. We haven't done that yet. So for now, just get this bit of code, okay, and copy it and paste it in right above the app function. Now this query looks ridiculous because we're not making a query about launches, we're making a query about quakes. So we'll have to change this. Now if you're wondering why these names are using all caps, that's just a convention in GraphQL. You don't have to follow it strictly, but I like to. Alright, and again, you can name your query whatever you like, so I'm going to call it Quake List, but not using camel case instead. Alright, now notice here, right, we're passing in these variables to our query. If you go to this page here, which is on GraphQL clients at graphql.org, right, shows you that when you want to use variables in your queries, it says here. Okay, well anyway, it shows you that you want to use these $signs followed by, say, the variable name and pass it in that way, and it says that you can use that syntax for the variables. Right, and it tells you why you'd want to do it, although that's a little bit beyond my understanding. Yeah, so basically you want to use these $sign variable things here. Okay, now remember after was just another way of referring to our cursor, so that what we could do is we could load all of the data after a certain point, which would be after that cursor value. Right, so we'll want to keep these in our query here. Right, but we're not calling it launches, we're calling it quakes. Now again, we can just go to our playground and we could get a custom query here, right? But we'll want to include, just as they have done, the cursor and has more fields in our query. And again, we can do that legally because if you go to your schema.js file, right, and you look at the return type, it's something called quake connection, right, and it has those fields, right? Cursor has more, and instead of launches, we have quakes. So include those in your query. So go back to your playground. All right, so we'll need cursor and has more. Right, and then we've got our quakes. So what we can do now is grab everything inside of our quakes query here. Actually, why don't we just do this? Just grab the entire quakes query because that's the easier way. Remember not to include the actual query part. We've already got that in our code. Copy that. Alright, so for here, just replace all that. Okay. Of course, the formatting is screwed up again, as it always is. Don't mind my bitterness about this. This is just probably my own inability to use VS Code to its, in the best way. So remember, we need to include those parameters here. So if you forgot what they were, you can just go back here, copy it, and paste it in. Okay. So we have a query. We're calling it getQuakes, and this is what we're going to pass to use query, right, which we're going to use in a moment here. Right, so our query looks fine. So now go down, you'll see that they have a bit more code, and this is where they bring in their function, right? We're not going to write it in exactly the same way. This is the function that you would want to export as a default, like you would normally do in React. So what you'll want to do is just copy everything from here to the bottom. All right, remember, we want to keep that function part there, so go all the way down and paste that in. All right, so we're calling our function not launches, but what? Quakes. Which means that we will want to change this as well. Okay, so those match up. Now when we use query, right, we're going to pass in, like I said, our query, which we called get quakes. All right, and from there you have attached to it the data, loading, and error properties that we saw earlier when we evaluated the data object in our console. All right, and it says here if the loading status is true, then, and they're returning a component. Remember, we didn't build those components, so we'll just basically return it as text. And we'll just say this. Okay, so now go down, and all we need to do is exchange launches for quakes. Right, remember, our data has quakes attached to it. Right, and if you are unsure about this structure, like I said, go back to that initial query that we made and we evaluated in the console, and check out the nature of the object that was returned. Right, our quakes are in the data part of the object. So we're saying that if we have a list of quakes, then what we'll want to do is we'll want to map over that list and then for each quake in that list we'll want to display certain things. Now again, they had this little component that they created called launch tile. All right, and we'll do that in a second. But first we'd like to just make sure that our query works, and we're not going to, if when we do create a component, we're not going to call it launch tile, we'll call it quake tile. Actually, why don't we just do that now, and just instead of going through this twice, we'll just kill two birds with one stone. Go back to your source folder, create a components folder. All right, and in there create a new file, and we're going to call that quake tile. We'll import React from React. What were we calling this? We'll just call it quake tile. And we can make this simple. It doesn't have to be anything too fancy. Not for demonstration purposes anyway. So maybe we'll put in a heading, right? And we'll just say this will be the quake. And then we'll also add to the title or the name the ID, right? And we're going to pass in as props some values that we get from our data object. Again, that crazy formatting. All right, and this is actually just going to be called ID. We don't have it available yet. All right. But we will bring it in as props later in this way. Bring in ID, magnitude, location, and when. And then for the rest, we'll just use P. So we'll say first the location, the location will just be location, of course. Next, we want to look at the magnitude. And then finally, we want to look at when it happened. Okay. So we'll be returning this object here, and maybe we should just style it up right off the bat so we don't have to go back and fix it later. So import a file called components, ./components.css. We don't have that file yet. So what you can do is you can go into your components folder and make that. Okay. So for a Quake tile, why don't we just give the overall name or the class name of this component? We'll call it Quake tile. Okay. So what do we want to do with that? Why don't we give it a background color of beige? Why don't we, first of all, let's just separate the title of the event from the details. So we'll put in a horizontal line here. All right, we'll give this a border of what, 2 pixels, solid, and let's make it light blue in color. All right, so we'll leave it there for now. All right, looks like we're exporting it just fine. All right, so now in our app.js file, let's go ahead and bring in that component. Right, and then here, change that to Quake. Remember with React, when you're going to display a list of values or whatever, you'll need to add a key to each one. Otherwise, you'll get a complaint from React. But here we're not using launch.id, we're using quake.id. All right, and then let's just break this up. Let's say the ID equals, same thing, quake.id, magnitude equals, of course, quake.magnitude, location equals quake.location, and then finally when equals quake.when. Okay, we're still getting an error. It says header is not defined, and that's because in their example, remember we just copied and pasted in their code, they have a header. All right, so we can make a header if we'd like. Why not? Go back to your components folder, add in a new file, call it header.js. All right, and of course import React from React. Stick with our naming convention, give the overall component a class name of header. Alright, inside the header we'll put in a title for our page. Remember I called the project Quake Hunter, so why not just give it that title. Okay, and then we'll use our components to style this, components style sheet. So our class name was header, so we'll use the header selector. We'll give it a background color of what? Let's say navy blue. And then we'll give the text color a color of white. All right. Okay, so now just make sure to import header. Okay. All right, finally, all of our errors go away. Okay, so we see that we're displaying our data here. It looks terrible, but it's there. We're using React to render our views. Now, one thing you see up here with our header, we've got these annoying white spaces here. So the first thing we could do is we could go into components.css, and we can say that h1 has a margin of 0. Alright, so that gets rid of that. Right. Also, we don't want our individual cards, remember, or our tiles, as we call them, to be as wide as the whole page. So let's go ahead and change those. Alright, so why don't we let the width be 40%. Okay, and set margin to auto. That should center everything. And then well, just take a look now. Okay, so everything got centered. And then if we would like our text to be centered, that's easy enough. You know how to do that. Text align, center. Good. Alright, so that looks a little bit better. Of course, we don't want them to be stacked on top of each other like that. So what we could do probably, just to make things easier, is say margin bottom for each one, and we'll say something like 20 pixels. Alright, so they're separated, and then we don't want them to be right up there against the header at the top. So what we could do is we could go back to our app.js. Alright, so we've already got a style sheet for our app.js file, so open that up. That's included in React app, create React app. Just get rid of everything in there. You don't need it. And so let's put a div in here. And actually, what are we going to do? We'll call this main. Sure, why not? Okay. So take all of this code here and put that inside of that div that we've just created. Okay, and then go into your app.css, use the main selector, and let's say padding, and we'll use 20 pixels. Okay, good. So that pushes everything down from the header. Right? And if you don't like that background to be white, you could just make it something else. Why not black? How does that look? Okay. So you see that we're bringing in our data and we are displaying it in, well, it's not the best way, of course. But it's, you know, meaningful. We can read it. It's organized. We've got the name of each event where it's a quake followed by the ID number of the event. We get these ID numbers that come straight from the earthquake catalog. And we've got the information that we wanted to see. Okay. But remember, we're only bringing in 20 events at a time. So this will be the first 20 tiles. But have no fear, because the use query feature that we were bringing in from the Apollo React hooks package allows us to do pagination easily, and they even give us the code for it. So go back to your Apollo docs, right? There's a part down there that says build a paginated list. And you can see that in your function, we're calling ours Quakes, right? They're using destructuring assignment to separate out all of the important properties that we'll need. And then they've added one more, and that's called fetch more, right? And that's for pagination. So go into your app.js file and add. And once you type in F, you'll see that fetch more pops up because that's part of the use query package. All right, so we'll add that there. And then to use it, right, we'll just add this bit of code right below the other logic that we had for getting our Quake list. All right, so that would be right below here. Now it's not going to format nicely, so give me a second here to just fix that up. Sorry, that was bad. All right, hold on a sec. You might think I'm a bit anal about this stuff, and you're right. Okay, that's probably still not that great. But anyway, one thing you can see right off the bat is they've got a component called button. We haven't made that component, and we're not going to. We're just going to use a simple HTML button. So just change your uppercase B to a lowercase b, and that'll be good. All right, but now we have in our code here all these references to launches, which we need to turn into Quakes, of course. So it's tedious, but we'll be done in a minute. So remember, our Quakes, our Quake objects, each one has a cursor attached to it, so we can leave pretty much the code as is and just change out the launches for Quakes. We're not bringing anything else in here, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay. Now, if you're wondering how all this code works, I'll leave it up to you to investigate the nature of fetch more result by consulting Apollo docs. This video is probably going to go on too long as it is. Although we're almost done with it for today. We'll move on to mutations in the next video. Alright, so hopefully we've done everything well. And if we have, then we should see that button at the bottom of the page. Okay, let's check. And we do. We've got the load more button. And if we click it, we should see another 20 events loaded, another 20 Quake cards. All right, recall when we made this query in GraphQL Playground, our last event had the ID of 866. So let's rerun this. So if you go down to the bottom, your last event has the ID of 866 and a cursor value of 560, right? So that means that if we want to see the next batch of events after this one, we use this cursor. And then for our Quakes query, we say after that cursor value. Right, and this is taken care of on the client side because we added that into our query already. Right, but it just takes whatever the last cursor is for that batch. Right, and if we run that, we see that the first event after that one has an ID of 871. that means when we click on the button here for load more, the ID of the first card that pops up after this one, after the one I'm highlighting now, that should have the 871 as the last 3 digits in the ID. All right, and it does. All right, so our pagination is working fine on the front end as well. And that's nice. I mean, we've got all that built into the Apollo React hooks package. Right? We didn't have to think it all up for ourselves. We don't have to reinvent any wheels. So at this point, I'm going to stop. I hope you got everything working, and if you haven't, well, then that's a bit of debugging for you. And if you have any questions or concerns about this, go ahead and let me know in the comment section below the video description. And next time, like I said, we'll focus on mutations, and we'll also, maybe not next time, but in the next few videos, we'll also get into using, to managing local state. So that might be very intuitive for those of you who are familiar with Redux. Anyway, as always, thank you for checking me out. I appreciate it, and I will see you next time.